Welcome, everyone. Thanks for taking some time out of your day to be here with me today. My name is Rebecca Johnson, and I'm a team member here at Am I Hungry? Some of you who are here today live or might be listening to this later via recording, I've spoken with, and I know you're in the process of considering whether Am I Hungry is right for you or your organization. And others of you I haven't had the pleasure of speaking with yet, but I suspect are here to learn more. And I think today will give you a glimpse of what the Am I Hungry approach feels like to participants that might help in your decision-making process. Just as a little bit of background on me before we jump in, I'll tell you that I discovered Am I Hungry about 10 years ago and have been actively involved since then, either facilitating workshops on my own or in the past few years, kind of working to help to spread the message in the corporate setting. When I went through the training in 2007 to become a facilitator myself, it really shifted my professional perspective on eating and self-care. And it also helped me kind of finally and truly resolve some of my own struggles with eating that I hadn't been able to quite resolve on my own. So I very much believe in the approach, and it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to chat with you all about it today. So what we're going to do today is just kind of walk through an introductory session that's very similar to the way we introduce participants to Am I Hungry if they're considering a workshop or the online program. Because the one thing I've learned about Am I Hungry is that it's more difficult to sort of theoretically explain how the approach is different and what you'll experience, and it's easier to simply give people a taste of it in a way that they can really relate to. And so that's what we're going to do today. As we talk, I might occasionally ask you to just kind of play along with me and give me some feedback. You should see in the top left of your screen a Q&A button and a chat button. And so if I ask for feedback and you want to offer it, you can just hop on over to your chat button and send in feedback to me. And then I'll save some time at the end for Q&A for sure for you to ask your questions and get them answered. So let's jump in. Let's start today with the assumption that most of us as just adults living in Western society and as health professionals have heard or said this message many times in our lives. Eat less and exercise more. And that in many cases, we are either using for ourselves or suggesting that clients and patients or employees use weight as a measure of progress with eating and health. And so on the surface, this all probably seems like relatively common sense. Most of us might agree that eating less and exercising more is a pretty good thing to shoot for, especially in our modern food abundant society. But we also might agree that it's increasingly difficult to do these things consistently, or at least do them consistently in a way that doesn't make us feel like our whole world is just focused on what we should eat and how much we should eat and how much we should exercise. So what happens for a lot of us is that instead of consistently eating and moving in ways that really nourish our body and kind of fuel the big life we want, we end up stuck in a yo-yo pattern, kind of on again, off again with eating and exercise, on the diet, off the diet, exercising a lot, not exercising at all, feeling in control, feeling out of control. If this pattern sounds familiar to you, you're not alone. And if you work in health promotion in any way, you've probably seen these patterns with your own clients or patients or employees a lot. There's a large body of research indicating that the conventional approach to eating less and moving more really doesn't create sustainable changes in weight or health for the vast majority of people. And there's a growing body of evidence indicating that this approach is actually doing more harm than good. And so that's what we're going to talk about today, only in kind of a personal, relatable way, which is why is this approach not working and what can we do instead? And as we talk through this, I would like to ask you to just see if you can put aside everything you know or think you know about food and eating and exercise and see if you can think about these things in a whole new way. Today, we're going to peel back just the first few layers and shine some light on the answers to these questions. And so as we do that, I'm going to introduce you to something called the mindful eating cycle. And the mindful eating cycle is a model that helps us understand the hundreds of decisions we make every day about eating and to a lesser degree about physical activity and other means of investing our energy. As you can see by what's on your screen, there are 6 decision points on the mindful eating cycle. There's why do I eat? In other words, what's the underlying purpose or motivation driving the eating cycle at any given time? Next is when do I eat or when do I want to eat? So when does the urge to eat arise and what causes that urge and what do I do about it? And then there's what do I eat? Out of all the available foods, what do I choose? At the bottom is how do I eat? And this has to do with how the manner in which I get the food from the plate or container into my body. And then there's how much do I eat? So how much fuel do I give my body? And finally, but very importantly, is where. Where do I invest my energy? And this has less to do with food and more to do with where we invest our physical and emotional and intellectual and spiritual energy. So how we're taking care of ourselves, which of course oftentimes it very much influences the decisions that we make with food. So I'm going to walk you through this cycle 3 different times, and I want you to be thinking about yourself or someone that you know fairly well. And the first time I walk you through it, I want you to think about someone you know who manages their relationship with food seemingly effortlessly. Someone who doesn't obsess about food or dieting or exercise. This might be you now, or maybe at another time in your life, or maybe it's a family member or a friend or coworker. If you're having trouble thinking of someone who doesn't seem to struggle with food, think of a child. They're the classic example of what we're looking for here, which is essentially someone who spends a lot of time in what we call the instinctive eating cycle. So let's walk through the instinctive eating cycle, thinking about this person. First, when we're eating instinctively, or if we're thinking about a person who does, the most frequent purpose for eating is the need for fuel. So the why, or the cycle driver, is physiological hunger. Now, this isn't to say that people who eat instinctively and don't struggle with food only eat when they're hungry, because they do occasionally eat for pleasure or other factors, but the main reason they start eating is usually hunger. In terms of when, well, they eat when the physical signs of true hunger strike and the food they're hungry for is available. They don't have to follow a list of rules about when they should and shouldn't eat. They just know when they need to eat. And then there's what do I eat? So this person that you're thinking of who seems to eat fairly instinctively, what do they choose to eat? The simple answer to that is pretty much whatever they want, right? And if you struggle with food or overeating yourself or feel like you need to chronically diet to keep things under control, this might even make you feel a little envious. So it's important to know here that people who eat instinctively select the food that they're hungry for or what they think is best and most satisfying. And some of them are conscious of nutrition and other factors when making their food choices, and some don't seem to pay much attention to nutrition information at all. Okay, this person that you're thinking about who eats instinctively, how do they eat? This can be a tough one to think of, so let me give you a word, which is intentionally. People who eat instinctively often eat with the intention of feeling better when they're done than they did when they started. And that sometimes means that they're attentive to food in their body and they're more likely to eat in kind of a calm, non rushed, undistracted atmosphere, oftentimes with enjoyment. How much do people who eat instinctively eat? Well, most of the time they eat until they're comfortably satisfied. And that might mean going back for seconds, or more often it means leaving perfectly good food on their plate. And yes, they do that even though there are starving children somewhere, and even though that means they won't get to be members of the Clean Plate Club. So they eat until they're comfortably satisfied or enough to satisfy hunger. And let's think about this question of where. Where does your energy go when you're in an instinctive eating cycle? Your physical energy can go towards work and play and exercise. Your mental energy can be focused on daily tasks and goals, and your emotional energy can be focused on your relationships and your feelings. Any leftover fuel is stored until it's needed, and then once the kind of readily available fuel is depleted, your body sends signs and symptoms of hunger. That triggers a desire to eat, and the cycle repeats itself. Now, if this version of the eating cycle sounds a lot like your current relationship with food, then kudos to you. Keep doing what you're doing because you are on the right track. For most of you, though, or at least for most of the clients and patients, employees that you work with, this instinctive eating cycle might not sound like your typical relationship with food. And that's the bad news. So the troubling news is that there are less and less people in our society today who spend a lot of time in the instinctive eating cycle, kind of eating and moving effortlessly. But the good news is that if you think about it, we were all really born with the ability to eat and move instinctively. We were born with the ability to know when and how much to eat. If you think about a baby or a young child, they will fuss until they're fed, and then when they've had enough, they will push the food away or move on to something else. So we all have this ability to eat instinctively, and we can return to this type of relationship with food given the right skills and tools and time. So let me pause there on that point. Because really the work of Am I Hungry is helping people return to this instinctive way of eating and add a little more intention and attention to their relationship with food as well. But before we get to the solution, let's talk through something else. I want you to think about a different person now. A person in your life, maybe you or someone else, a friend, a family member, a colleague, who seems to struggle with food and possibly weight, but not always. So perhaps they have a love hate relationship with food. Maybe they eat to excess frequently or they seem overly focused on food. It's possible that this person or you, if you're thinking about yourself with this description, that you spend time in the overeating cycle. And the overeating cycle is just a different way of relating to food. It's a different way of kind of moving through these decision points. And so let's talk about the differences here. In the overeating cycle, what's the why? Sometimes we start eating because we truly need food because of physiological hunger, but other times we start eating because of triggers. There are three types of non-hunger triggers. Physical triggers are things like thirst or fatigue or pain or even hormonal cycles. The second type of trigger is environmental, and the list of environmental triggers is almost infinite. So, for example, perhaps you associate watching TV in the evening with eating, or going to the movies and having popcorn, or simply seeing a fast food sign and then having a desire to eat. Now, there are also, outside of physical and environmental triggers, there are emotional triggers. So when we're in an overeating cycle, we might eat frequently in response to things like stress or overwhelm or boredom or anger. Or we might eat in response to comfortable and pleasurable emotions like love and celebration and the desire for a reward. Really, any emotion can be a trigger for eating, even the pleasurable ones. In fact, this is an important point that I want to leave you with today, which is that for many people, why is the missing link? Many of the traditional approaches to eating and self-care focus on restrictive strategies and about what and when and how much you should eat without addressing why you're eating in the first place. But since why is the driver of the cycle, it influences all the decisions you'll make about eating afterwards. And so it's kind of ironic that it's not usually addressed. Okay, let's think about when. So when we're in an overeating cycle and we're eating frequently in response to triggers, when do we eat or when does the desire to eat arise? All the time, right? Way more often than when our body really needs fuel. And particularly because we live in a food abundant society and environmental triggers abound, there are just endless temptations and opportunities to eat. And what do you eat when you're in an overeating cycle? If you're eating because you're sad, mad, glad, stressed, bored, or in response to environmental triggers, what do you often feel like eating? I don't know about you, but this is not the time when I am likely to grill up a small piece of lean chicken and steam some broccoli, right? More often when we're in an overeating cycle, we have the desire to eat foods that are highly palatable and oftentimes very energy dense. French fries, potato chips, chocolate, ice cream, candy, bread, You name it, each one of us probably has a different set of comfort foods. And the point here, though, is not that there's something wrong with these foods, because I would say there's absolutely nothing inherently wrong with chocolate and French fries. In fact, they can be a great place to experience pleasure and just simply enjoy something we love. They really only become a problem when we repeatedly turn to them out of mindless and automatic habit, or when they are our primary mechanism for coping with or stuffing down or avoiding feelings. And so, in fact, if you think about it, when we repeatedly use food of any type in this way, we're trying to meet a need that food really can't meet. And the other thing to think about, too, is that why we're eating often determines what we eat. So, for example, if we are eating purposefully for fuel and nourishment, we're more likely to choose foods that are nutrient dense and nourishing. If we're eating because we're stressed or bored or influenced by a fast food commercial, we're more likely to eat things that taste pleasurable in the short term, but which may leave us feeling worse after we've eaten than we did before we started. Okay, let's talk about how we eat in an overeating cycle, meaning how does the food get from the package or serving dish into our body? If you've ever been in an overeating cycle, what words come to mind for you? Maybe mindlessly, while distracted, quickly, in a hurry, maybe even secretly. There are all sorts of reasons that we eat mindlessly and quickly and secretly, but one of the many problems with doing so is that we're very likely not to experience the satisfaction we want from the food, even though that was really the reason we were seeking food in the first place. And so that brings us to the next point is when we're not present to experience the food and its effects on our body, and we're eating mindlessly and quickly, we're much more likely to eat more than our body needs. So when we're in an overeating cycle, how much we eat is often not determined by how much our body needs, but by things like until the plate is clean or the package is empty, or we feel uncomfortable and terribly guilty, or someone comes home. So the point is that we eat more than our body has asked for and more than leaves us feeling good. There are many, many reasons why we eat past the point of satiety when we're in an overeating cycle. But one of the big ones is because we are disconnected from our own internal cues, or we've forgotten how to respond to them effectively. This idea is summed up in the quote you see on your screen. If hunger didn't tell you when to start eating, what will tell you to stop? If you're not eating because of hunger or you've already eaten past it, then you end up having to rely on external cues or significant internal discomfort to tell you when to stop. Okay, last decision point in the overeating cycle. Where do we invest our energy when we're in an overeating cycle? Let's think about this. So, first of all, when our body has to digest extra food, we might feel more sluggish, and so we're likely to be less active. So we are less likely to invest physical energy in tasks and productivity and exercise. We also know that the food that's consumed when we don't need it will be stored for later. We know that mental energy, oftentimes when we're in an overeating cycle, is spent beating ourselves up, feeling guilty or feeling shameful or regretful, or trying to find the next diet to get it all under control. You can see how this becomes a cycle because when you eat food your body didn't ask for, you don't feel as good or have the energy that you might. And that drives more overeating. And more importantly, eating really can't meet needs other than temporary pleasure and distraction. So whatever the unmet needs were that were driving the eating to begin with, continue to go unmet and continue to drive the same cycle. Okay, let's switch gears one last time. Let's walk through the cycle thinking about someone who seems to use diets or other rules-based plans to control their eating. So think of someone in your life, and again, this may be you now or at another time in your life, or a colleague, a family member, a friend. Think of someone who seems to be preoccupied with food, and maybe their weight and maybe exercise. Perhaps they're always talking about the latest diet or what they ate or how good or bad they were based on what they ate. Keep this person in mind as we talk through this cycle again, only with yet a third set of uh, methods for relating to the very same decision points. So we call this the restrictive eating cycle. In the restrictive eating cycle, and that could be when you're following a formal diet or when you are following a rules-based plan that some authority said that you should follow or that you heard about from your neighbor or some set of rules around food that you've put together from all the other diets you've ever tried in the past. Restrictive eating doesn't necessarily mean a formal diet. It can mean other rules-based plans as well. So when we're trying to follow plans like that, what's the why? What is the thing that drives all of the other decisions? It's rules, right? The latest experts' rules or your own rules. So external rules govern virtually all aspects of your choices. When you're in a restrictive eating cycle, when do you allow yourself to eat? Well, you eat when the rules tell you can, and you try very hard not to eat when the rules say you shouldn't. The ironic thing about this, if you've ever tried to follow a kind of predetermined plan about when you should or should not be eating, is that sometimes it's not aligned with your own internal cues of hunger. So you might find that you feel like you should eat when you're not hungry because the rules say you should, or that you are not eating when you are hungry. You can probably begin to see how over time this kind of disconnects us from our body's own wisdom about when we need fuel. Okay, so let me just give you some examples that are really common in our society today about when we should eat. Always eat breakfast, right? Because breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Only if you've had a large amount of food at 10 or 11 or 12 o'clock at night, perhaps that rule doesn't apply in such a black and white way. Don't eat after 6 or 7 p.m. Eat every 2 to 3 hours. And God forbid, don't let yourself get hungry. So these are just examples of some of the rules that we often hear or perhaps even say to other people, and which uh, can further disconnect us from our own internal signals or at least confuse us about when we should and shouldn't be eating. What do we eat in a restrictive eating cycle? Here's where things get really confusing, right? The rules of you eat basically what the rules of the current diet or plan tell you to eat. This might mean you try not to eat any carbohydrates at all, or you only eat the quote unquote good carbohydrates. You focus on eating low fat or non-processed foods, or you don't eat sugar. You've probably noticed that the rules of healthy eating change frequently, and they really differ depending on who's talking about them. So, in addition to these types of rules specifically about food, when you're in a restrictive eating cycle, what you eat might be based on things like calories or grams or exchanges or points or other ways of determining what you should eat. Might also be influenced by the scale or how well you feel you followed your diet the day before. The other tricky thing about this is that when we are in this cycle, we end up oftentimes not being able to eat the foods we really love, which is one reason we can be left feeling deprived. And we'll talk about how the feeling of deprivation is kind of counterproductive here in a few minutes. Okay, how do we eat when we are in the restrictive eating cycle? Again, this can be a challenging one to think about, so let me give you a word, and that word is rigidly. So food is prepared and consumed in kind of a controlled, rigid manner. You might have to weigh or measure or count your food or write it all down to keep track. And so there becomes kind of a preoccupation and an inflexibility around eating. It may mean that you feel there's certain restaurants that you can't go to or that you need to look at the restaurant menu in advance. Determining kind of when and what and how much to eat really becomes a chore. How much do we eat in a restrictive eating cycle? Again, that's determined by the rules. We eat the allowed amount, and the allowed amount might be something like 1 ounce of cheese or 12 grapes or 4 grams of carbs or a certain number of total points or something. So, in some forms of the restrictive eating cycle, we're eating less than our body needs, which is another reason that we can end up feeling deprived. And that takes us to where? Where do we invest our energy in a restrictive eating cycle? There are several answers to this question. Let's talk about them. The first one is that sticking to a diet or a restrictive rules based plan requires a lot of mental and emotional and sometimes even physical energy. So a lot of your energy is consumed with when and what and how much you're going to eat and what the number on the scale says and how much you're exercising. And so your energy is spent in large part on diet and exercise, which, if you think about it, is a relatively small part of your life. It can begin to feel consuming. Now, speaking of exercise, what has happened, and this I think is especially fostered when we're in the restrictive eating cycle or teaching others about it, is that exercise is often thought of or used as something to earn the right to eat or to pay penance for eating something bad or eating too much. People often exercise like they eat, rigidly and without enjoyment. And so, with all the messages positioning exercise as a mathematical necessity for weight loss or a must for health, it's really no wonder that so many people say they hate to exercise. So, what happens over time for many people is essentially this: some form of the restrictive eating cycle is adopted, usually to help prevent or make up for the overeating cycle, or because they think that this is a necessary way to relate to food. This is what they've been taught in order to be healthy. And I have kind of air quotes around healthy there. But as many of you have probably experienced, the restrictive eating cycle is not sustainable for a lifetime, or for most of us, even for a few months or weeks or days. And I want to talk briefly about why that is. Why is it that this cycle is not sustainable? First of all, as we talked about, restrictive eating just requires too much time and energy and willpower, all of which are, uh, I would say, precious commodities for most of us. It also leads to deprivation and preoccupation. And because of the biological and physiological consequences of restricting food intake, which are many and varied, our body will begin to illustrate signs of increased hunger, greater cravings to eat, and over time will eventually give up or give in because we can almost never win against our biology. And we will overeat and then feel guilty about it, and then the cycle is fueled. So, what really happens is that the solution of restrictive eating is almost never sustainable, and it ends up fueling the problem rather than helping solve it. And on that note, part of the reason why it fuels the problem and doesn't help resolve it is because it doesn't address the real reasons that people overeat or the real reasons that people become preoccupied with food in other ways. And so those unmet needs and those ingrained beliefs and thoughts and feelings that are not effective are never addressed, and they continue to drive problematic eating. I've mentioned this too, but restrictive eating really kind of ignores our own internal authority and our body wisdom. So it further disconnects us from our own ability to care for ourselves and makes us reliant on experts' rules. And then lastly, if you think about it, life is not black and white. It is not all or nothing. And when you're trying to follow a diet or restrictive eating plan, your thought processes and behaviors around food really become black and white. And so it makes it difficult to kind of fit food and eating into the larger fabric of our lives in a way that feels good. So eventually, the restrictive eating cycle becomes too consuming or requires too much energy or leaves us feeling deprived or crazy or like we're missing out, or we cheat a little bit and it snowballs into overeating. And we end up yo yoing back to the other end of the spectrum, going from tightly wound up in the restrictive eating cycle to out of control in the overeating cycle. We call this cycle the eat, repent, repeat cycle. And many people actually kind of vibrate in a constant state between these two ends of the spectrum, oftentimes feeling bad and out of control when they're overeating, good and in control when they're eating restrictively, albeit with the knowledge that it is not sustainable. So, the eat, repent, repeat cycle, if any of you have ever been in it yourself, is a really unpleasant place to be. And there's lots of negative consequences. The evidence is pretty clear that this eat, repent, repeat cycle fosters weight cycling or the repeated loss and gain of weight. It fosters disordered eating, and over time, it sort of diminishes our well-being and quality of life rather than enhancing it. So, what's the alternative to the eat, repent, repeat cycle? The good news is that there is one. And as you've probably gathered by now, we believe it has a great deal to do with mindfulness. And so let me just kind of talk about shifting the model altogether. So there tends to be the yo-yo model in place. We're either eating restrictively and tightly wound up or overeating and out of control. Mindfulness helps us change the model altogether so that we start to think more in terms of a pendulum. You can kind of imagine how if you pull a pendulum too far back toward restrictive eating and hold it there, well, first of all, it takes a lot of energy. And when you let it go, what happens? Of course, it swings all the way over to the other side. And that's why diets and other forms of restrictive eating are so often followed by overeating. So the goal is to find a smaller arc between these two extremes where you have the flexibility to eat what you love and the awareness to love what you eat and really use food to fuel the big life you crave. Let me talk specifically about how mindful eating helps. I'm going to give you just a little example about how adopting a greater sense of mindfulness around food can help in some really common strategies. So let's use the common scenario of going to the movies. When we're mindless uh, and we go to the movies, perhaps it's our habit to uh, order the same size popcorn and eat a lot of it, or maybe all of it ourselves. Perhaps it's just a habit. We go to the movies, we order the same size popcorn and a drink, and we eat it all. Now, there's nothing wrong with eating popcorn at the movies. Again, this is just a great example of how strong the link can be between a trigger and a mindless or automatic reaction. So the point is that when we're mindless, we simply react to the trigger or cue of going to the movies with ordering and eating a lot of popcorn. No checking in with our body, no considering whether something else might fit the moment better. And so when we react in this way over and over again, we get the same results. Let's use the same example to think about how this scenario might feel a little bit differently if we applied mindfulness to it. So because mindfulness helps us develop the ability to pause and to become aware of what's going on and make intentional decisions about whether and how to respond, if we are thinking about going to the movies, we might handle this a little bit differently. For example, we might get to the movies and realize that we're actually quite full from dinner, so we just order a drink and skip the popcorn. Or maybe we really love popcorn and we feel like it totally makes the movie experience, so we adjust our eating beforehand. We have a smaller dinner or no dinner so that we can go to the movies and really enjoy popcorn and be hungry for it. Or maybe we get the same size popcorn, but we split it with someone else. And that's the point, is that there isn't a black and white answer every single time for this scenario. There are options. And so instead of being a slave to automatic reactions, mindfulness helps us consider intentionally and choose what's best for us in the moment. So in this case, we don't have to choose based on an external authority's rules about whether we should or should not be eating popcorn or how much of a serving of popcorn is appropriate, but based on our own body wisdom, how we want to feel afterwards, and what we choose to prioritize at that moment. So the bottom line is that mindfulness allows us to respond, to intentionally respond rather than automatically react. This, of course, is a really simple concept, but it is not always easy to implement, especially if you've been struggling with food for a long time. And we get that. And so that's why we have a full program kind of devoted to the process of change using mindfulness. So, what I want to do today, though, before I tell you about that, is leave you with a couple of takeaways, some things that you can be thinking about starting today and just experimenting with in your own life. The first one is to remember that having a healthful relationship with food means so much more than simply following rules about when and what and how much to eat. It means considering why you're eating in the first place, how you're eating, and whether or not you're investing your energy in self care that ultimately makes you less likely to turn to food to address unmet needs. The second takeaway is to remember that you were born with the instinctive ability to know how and when and how much to eat and how much to move. For most people, the internal body wisdom really is there. It's just a matter of reconnecting with it, trusting it, and learning how to respond to it more effectively. So, what I might encourage you to do today is when you notice a desire to eat, see if you can just pause for a minute, just a quick moment. Maybe take a few deep breaths to tune into the present moment and ask yourself one seemingly simple question. Am I hungry? Am I hungry? And then look for physical signs that you need fuel. If they're not there, see if you can identify what else might be driving your desire to eat. Could it be a physical or environmental or emotional trigger? Maybe some combination of triggers? And I want to pause here and just make a note that the point of asking this simple but powerful question is not to determine if you're allowed to eat, but to help you figure out why you want to in the first place. So I would encourage you not to turn the question of am I hungry into black and white diet thinking, but simply use the question as a place to pause, a way to make space between whatever you notice and your potential reaction to it. A place really to cultivate awareness about what's going on so that you have a better chance of responding intentionally rather than reacting automatically. And on that point, the last thing I would leave you with here today is that from this awareness, you might recognize that the urge to eat really is about the need for fuel. And in that case, and of course, food is a great answer. And when you eat, eat with intention and attention. Choose foods that satisfy and nourish, and really be present with your food so you can notice it and the effects on your body. But if you notice that the urge to eat is about something else, perhaps you actually discover that you're really tired and you were just kind of looking for an energy boost in food. Or maybe you're just thirsty and a drink of water will do the trick. Or maybe you recognize that there's some emotion driving the urge, like anxiety or overwhelm, or even the desire for a reward. Use your awareness to help you make a decision about what will best meet your needs in this moment. Because although it can be really tempting to eat to meet other needs, the only need that food can really meet is the need for physical nourishment. So I hope today's conversation has helped you begin to see why the traditional approach to eating really hasn't created sustainable change and how mindfulness can help. I encourage you this week just to experiment with pausing and creating awareness about why you do what you do or don't do what you don't do. Mindfulness starts with awareness, and awareness is best cultivated by just creating space and asking ourselves the right questions. So I'm going to wrap today by just giving you a little bit more information about how you can access more of this approach if it's resonated with you. We've been in business since 1999, and we now have a variety of ways for people to get involved and for health professionals to teach these concepts. I'm just going to take about 2 minutes to describe those to you, and then I want to open it up for Q&A. So if you're interested in mindful eating to transform your own relationship with food, or just wondering how this is available to clients or patients or employees, we do have live workshops delivered by trained facilitators. We have a mindful eating support community. There is an online self-paced version of the program. There are trained mindful eating coaches that clients and patients and employees can access. We do have multi-day retreats, and for kind of the least investment of time and energy, we also have books and workbooks which can be purchased independently. The website to learn more about how you can become involved as an individual is amihungry.com, and you would just click on the How Can I Learn to Eat Mindfully tab. If you're interested in health professional training, in addition to the original mindful eating program, which is the most universal and applicable, we do have specialty programs for diabetes, bariatric surgery, binge eating, and students, and we have training in all of these programs available to give you the skills and tools and abilities really to deliver a very turnkey workshop in pretty much any corporate, clinical, or community setting. Our trainings are online and self-paced and very, very comprehensive. Regardless of which one you choose, you do get the added benefit of being able to progress through the program as a participant yourself as you're learning how to facilitate or coach, so you have the chance to know what it feels like to be the client or participant, and also so that you can work on your own relationship with food if it happens to need any attention. amihungry.com/train with us is the place to learn more about that. And then lastly, if you're interested in our programs and services for your organization, you can go to the website and click on Online Mindful Eating Program for Organizations, or just contact me. One place to read a chapter of the book that goes with the program is to go to amihungry.com/chapter1. This is a free download. A lot of what you read there will be similar to what we talked about today in the webinar, but there'll be extra information. And it will give you or your clients or patients, employees, a really good place to kind of get a sense of what Am I Hungry is about. So I'm going to just leave my contact information on the screen and would love to hear from you. What questions do you have about the approach? What's bubbling up for you? What feedback do you have? In the top left corner of your toolbar, you should see a black button that says Q&A. And I would encourage you just to jot your questions down and send them in here. Now I'll just be quiet for a minute while I wait for questions to come in. No questions so far. That either means that you are a shy group or I've covered all the details. Well, I'll give it just another minute here and give you some space to think. And please feel free to jot down my contact information, rjohnson@amihungry.com or 480-704-7811, extension 401. I would love to hear from you, and I'm happy to just set up a phone call and chat more about what you learned today or options for you or your organization. So with that, if there are no questions, then I'll just thank you so much for your time today. I appreciate you carving out an hour to be with me, and look forward to being in touch at a later date. Have a great weekend.